Tom, we were just hearing from Sir Keir Starmer in the Commons yesterday with that very powerful story of John Robinson. As you said a little bit earlier in the programme, really changed the tone and the mood in the chamber. But you've got an interesting update on that.
That's right. It's understandable as to why the Prime Minister can't say anything other than sorry, how bad it would look to try and explain the situation in which he found himself. However, by the 19th of June 2020, it was actually legal in this country to see dying relatives or indeed dying friends in homes, in hospitals, in hospices and in care homes. The regulations had changed a week earlier, and this was set out in terms of the stages of lockdown easing that the country had seen over the previous weeks and months. By this stage, it was legal to have indoor retail, to move homes, to go to showrooms, indeed to prepare a house that you might want to move into as well. There were all sorts of changes to the rules, including seeing up to 6 people outdoors as well. So these comparisons from the height of lockdown compared to various other stages sometimes aren't particularly comparable directly. However, of course, if the Prime Minister were to say any of that, it would look like he was scuttling away. It would look awful in response to that tragedy. So I think it's important to understand the context surrounding the time, even though it's understandable as to why the Prime Minister doesn't feel like he could say that in the chamber.
Yeah, and look, there may be a lot of sympathy for that argument on this occasion. The worry is that this story just doesn't go away. It continues to undermine his authority, and eventually one of the 6 parties will not be as forgivable, perhaps. Is that a risk for the Prime Minister, do you think?
That's certainly a risk, although when we're talking about these parties, and very often when the opposition brings up a particular gathering or another, it almost seems like they all merge together. You hear the word party and you don't sort of see the specific context in which it is, that it's people who were in a building that houses over 300 people who were there for work purposes. Now, whether they do something that might be considered more social or more work at one particular point in the day, it's a matter to some extent for interpretation. And clearly the Met Police are going through these events one by one, deciding in some very grey areas in terms of what passes from work to being a party. But also, of course, these all took place under varying different stages of whether it's the tiering system, whether it's lockdown easing, whether it's rule of 6, whatever it is. It was a very complicated 2 years.
Beside me now, James Johnson, Pollster.
No relation.
No relation that we know of. So basically, Downing Street will be doing their polls. You've been in there working there before, you know how that works. Will they be getting told the same things you're getting told about the Prime Minister from the public?
Yeah, I expect they certainly will.
Which is?
Which is a very hostile view indeed. We did a poll over the weekend that showed that 72% of people held a negative opinion of the Prime Minister, and the most commonly used word when they describe the Prime Minister is liar. Now, back when Boris Johnson first became Prime Minister, Labour voters, die-hard opponents of the Prime Minister, might use that word. But now that is being used by swing voters and current and former Conservatives alike.
We're looking at your word cloud on the screen. So this is all the words that appeared in relation to the Prime Minister, but the most prominent and the most commonly brought up was the word liar, as you can see in the middle.
Yeah.
I suppose it goes in order of regularity, so the ones furthest out least brought up.
Though interesting, it kept the Speaker busy yesterday, didn't it? Omitting that particular word from any debate.
Yes, and I think an MP shouted, "Look at the word cloud" at the Prime Minister, which wasn't quite expected when we put it together. But look, it is a serious situation for Boris Johnson and the Conservatives. I expect they are seeing the same thing, because you would have seen a story late last week showing that actually Boris Johnson is not appearing on many local election leaflets. There wasn't a formal local election launch.
Yeah.
That often tells you a lot more about what the political parties are seeing in their private polling, as exactly the same happened with Corbyn.
James, I'd love you to break down for me, if you could, you talk about a serious situation. Can the public distinguish? It will often be said Ukraine is much more important than this. It's very, very serious. It's much more serious than so-called Partygate. Can the public actually distinguish between the two, or do they agree with that train of thought?
They can absolutely distinguish between the two, and I think the lesson of the last 4 months in terms of public opinion has been the public are very capable of holding two thoughts in their mind at the same time. On the one hand, they do think that Ukraine is very important, and they do think that Boris Johnson has done a good job on Ukraine, and they think the UK is showing world leadership. But at the same time, they are also able to be very angry and furious about Partygate. And this is what I think some commentators and some analysts are slightly missing, is that even if voters want to move on, that doesn't mean they're going to vote for the Prime Minister anymore. You know, it's move on, not going to vote for him. And that's a really difficult thing. You know, the brand damage of Partygate is going to last beyond the story, I think, in voters' minds.
And is that something you'd agree with, Tom Harwood, then? Do you think, you know, is that the mood music that you're hearing? And I suppose critically it will be what the MPs think in the next couple of days with this vote on Thursday.
Now, I spent a long time last night talking to Conservative MPs immediately after that extraordinary session of the House of Commons, but also after that party meeting at 8 p.m. last night when the Prime Minister spoke to almost rally the troops, in a sense. And I just didn't get the sense that this was a Prime Minister that was on the edge of something. I didn't get the sense that there was the same jeopardy that was faced, particularly among those 2019 intake MPs, the ones who were almost plotting to remove the Prime Minister 3 months ago. They seem to be much more on board now. And potentially this was because when the Ukraine crisis hit and Partygate moved out of the news agenda, we did see a shift in the polls. We did see that gap between Labour and the Conservatives start to close again, go down to 3 or 4 points in some polls, down from double digits. So I think amongst MPs there is a sense that this is recoverable, just not whilst it's being spoken about all the time.
James, Tom says recoverable. Maybe it's called keeping your powder dry for the MPs, because they are waiting, your polls say, for 3 things. They're waiting to see what happens with further fines, waiting for the Sue Gray report, local elections and the by-election in Wakefield.
Yeah, and I think those electoral moments are going to be really significant for MPs. I do think there is a risk, though, that MPs look for really, really bad results and take quite bad results as a good reading for them.
Yes.
The Conservatives don't need a John Major-style election defeat, 1997-style wipeout, in order to lose power. They can lose their majority while being ahead in votes in a general election. So this is really, I think, a question of not are we looking at a massive wipeout in May, but actually is this something that we can weather for the long term? And I think increasingly there is a gulf widening between what Tory MPs think and what the public think. And there is a real risk that bad but not horrendous results in May might mean that Tory MPs say this is fine, and actually they carry on sleepwalking into a very difficult election result in 2024.
Thank you. James Johnson, pollster from JL Partners. Thank you very much indeed. And Tom Harwood. Tom's show begins at 9:30 today. Thanks, Tom.